In 2005, Ridley Scott released Kingdom of Heaven, and Edward Norton played a character we never quite see. His Baldwin IV moves through Jerusalem behind a polished silver mask, expressionless and otherworldly. It's one of the most memorable images in modern historical film, and many people assumed there was truth to the depiction, but the truth is, it's also almost entirely invented. There's no contemporary account from the 12th century Crusader kingdom that describes a metal mask covering the king's face. The visual was a creative choice by the filmmakers, an attempt to externalize the isolation of a young man dying of leprosy in front of his own court. Norton has spoken about how the mask let him work primarily through voice and movement. As cinema, it's brilliant. As history, it never happened. The more interesting question, then, isn't whether the silver mask is real. It's whether Baldwin wore anything at all to obscure his condition, and what the historical record actually says about a king watching himself disappear. Baldwin was born in Jerusalem in the summer of 1161, the son of King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. His childhood was supervised by William of Tyre, a learned cleric who'd later become archbishop and produce one of the great chronicles of the Latin East. William knew Baldwin from boyhood, sat with him during illness, and is, by a wide margin, the most important witness we have to who Baldwin actually was. According to William's account, the first sign of something wrong came when Baldwin was about 9. The prince was playing roughly with other boys, the kind of game where children dug their nails into one another's arms to test endurance. The other children winced and pulled away, but Baldwin didn't. He held still, smiling, while the others tore at his skin, because the nerves in his right arm could no longer register sensation. William noticed, and a physician was summoned. Treatments were attempted, ranging from herbal poultices to bloodletting, all of them useless against the slow advance of the disease. By the time Baldwin reached his early teens, the symptoms had spread, and the eventual diagnosis was leprosy. When Amalric died unexpectedly in July 1174, the kingdom inherited a problem no one knew how to solve. Baldwin was 13. He was the legitimate heir, intelligent and admired by his tutors, but he was also visibly ill in an age that regarded leprosy with religious dread. The realm he was about to inherit sat on a narrow strip of contested coastline, surrounded by Muslim powers that were starting, under Saladin, to coalesce into a single threat. If he had been incapable, some act of human intervention would likely have taken place, but despite his affliction, he showed great promise, and the coronation went ahead anyway. Baldwin became king, and within 3 years, against every expectation, he led a force of a few hundred knights to do something unthinkable. He ambushed Saladin's much larger army near the ruined fortress of Montgisard in November 1177. He carried the relic of the True Cross with him into the field, an object that contemporary chroniclers credited with the impossible victory that followed. The Crusaders shattered the Sultan's forces, and Saladin barely escaped with his life. This is the part of his story that doesn't fit the cinematic image of a doomed invalid behind a mask. For most of his short reign, Baldwin was an active, mounted, fighting king who rode at the head of his men and dealt with envoys, noble feuds, and border raids in person. The chronicles describe him as eloquent, courteous, and capable of making decisions that more experienced men feared to make. William of Tyre is unusually frank about his student's appearance and condition. He writes about the progression with the careful attention of someone who loved the boy and had to watch the disease consume him in pieces. The lepromatous form, which modern paleopathologists studying the case believe is the most likely diagnosis, follows a brutal trajectory. It thickens the skin, particularly around the face, producing the characteristic nodules that gave the disease its terrible reputation. Peripheral nerves rot from within, leading to loss of sensation, ulceration, and the eventual loss of fingers, toes, and parts of the face. William describes Baldwin losing the use of his hands and feet, the king's vision failing, his voice becoming weaker and harder to understand. What he doesn't describe anywhere is a mask or any attempt to cover up the disease. Modern medical analysis, drawing on both the historical record and the known pathology of leprosy, lines up with William's chronology. The early loss of sensation in a single limb, followed by years of gradual escalation, fits a lepromatous course in someone whose immune system can't contain the bacterium. Skeletal remains studied from medieval leper hospitals confirm how late-stage cases produce the collapsed features that became the disease's signature in the period's art. Baldwin's appearance by the end of his life would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who'd ever seen the disease before. Other contemporary writers in the Latin East and in Europe were aware of the king's condition, yet none of them mention a covering. If something as visually striking as a metal or cloth mask had been used to conceal his face during public audiences, it's the kind of detail that would have been noted by at least one of them. It turns out that leprosy in the Crusader states wasn't quite the social death it was elsewhere, especially in Western Europe. The Order of St. Lazarus, originally a hospital order caring for leper pilgrims at Jerusalem, gradually took on a military role and fought in Crusader campaigns. Knights who contracted the disease during service could retire into the order rather than be cast out of arms entirely. It was a strange institution that says something about the place of leprosy in this society, not fully outside the world of politics and warfare, even as it carried a heavy spiritual stigma. Baldwin existed in a culture that was, in its own grim way, somewhat prepared to imagine a leper with a sword in his hand. Despite there not being any apparent effort to hide King Baldwin's appearance with a mask, that doesn't mean there was no effort to manage his appearance. Coins minted during Baldwin's reign show a young, idealized king, untouched by disease. Royal seals follow the same convention, but this isn't unusual or sinister. Medieval rulers were almost always depicted on coinage in stylized, symbolic form. The image being projected was kingship, not portraiture. Baldwin's coins look like his father's coins and his grandfather's coins. You can't draw any real conclusions about his face from them, since these are always idealized images anyway. In court ceremony, contemporary accounts suggest Baldwin appeared in public when he was able, and was carried in a litter when he wasn't. Toward the very end of his life, in the campaigns of 1183 and 1184, he was reportedly transported on a stretcher at the head of his army, blind and unable to ride. There's a reference in some later sources to him being shielded by curtains or hangings on the litter. This may not have been done to hide his appearance, though, perhaps being done to protect his extremely sensitive skin from sun, dust, and sand. Some modern historians have wondered whether moments like these inspired the later folk image of a hidden, masked king. But shielding a slowly dying man on a stretcher from the elements isn't the same thing as a polished silver visor at court. Baldwin spent the last 2 years of his life in a state that's difficult to read about. He was probably blind by the end, his hands gone or useless, his ability to walk gone with them. Despite all of this, he was still making political decisions, still issuing charters, still trying to manage the succession crisis that would tear the kingdom apart after he died. His 7-year-old nephew, also named Baldwin, was already being raised as the future king, and the great lords of the realm were maneuvering around the inevitable. He passed in March of 1185, not yet 24 years old. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, beside the kings who'd come before him. In the end, there's no 12th century evidence that Baldwin IV of Jerusalem wore a mask, silver or otherwise. The image belongs entirely to modern cinema, fed by a long tradition of medieval art and fiction that's used masks to symbolize disease, secrecy, and stigma. What the historical record gives us instead is something stranger, and in its way, harder to look at. A boy who became a king, who fought and ruled and governed while his body unmade itself in public view, witnessed and described by a tutor who couldn't save him. There's a small patch of grass in Massachusetts where the world changed before sunrise. Eyewitnesses on both sides watched the same 45 seconds unfold and walked away with versions of the morning that simply can't be reconciled with each other. One man fired before all the others, and nobody can tell you with certainty who he was, which side he was on, or whether he ever meant to pull the trigger at all. The first shot of the American Revolution is a shot without an owner, and the hunt for the shooter has been running for 2.5 centuries without producing a verdict that satisfies anyone. By the early hours of April 19, 1775, the village of Lexington had been awake for most of the night. Word from Boston had traveled fast, carried in part by Paul Revere and William Dawes, that General Thomas Gage's regulars were marching out of the city under cover of darkness. They had orders to seize the colonial powder and arms stockpiled at Concord, about 6 miles further on. There was also softer intelligence that the British column might attempt to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Captain John Parker was 45 years old, a French and Indian War veteran, a farmer, and by several accounts already wasting away with tuberculosis. He had between 70 and 80 men under his command in the Lexington militia, and in the dim hours before dawn he gathered them on the common. Then he sent most of them across the road to a tavern called Buckman's to wait until something actually happened. There were also onlookers around the edges of the green, neighbors and boys, and a handful of men who'd come out armed but weren't on the formal muster roll. The British advance guard, 6 light infantry companies under Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, came up the road from Cambridge sometime around 5 in the morning. The sky was beginning to gray, but the sun wasn't fully up. There was enough light to make out shapes, but not yet enough to make out faces. When the British column rounded the curve and saw Parker's militia drawn up on the common, Pitcairn rode forward with at least 1 or 2 other mounted officers. By his own account, written to Gage shortly afterward, Pitcairn ordered the militia to disperse and lay down their weapons. Parker, for his part, gave an order to his men to disperse, though there's no surviving evidence that he ever told them to put down their weapons. What happened in the next handful of seconds is the black box at the heart of the entire revolution. Several of Parker's men would later swear that they heard a British officer shout an order along the lines of, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels," or words very close to that. A single shot cracked the morning air. After that came a ragged volley from somewhere on the field, and then the disciplined British return fire that did most of the damage. 8 Lexington men were cut down before most of them had even taken a full step off the grass. Among them was Jonas Parker, a relative of the captain, who was reportedly trying to reload his musket when a regular ran him through with a bayonet. Another, Jonathan Harrington, crawled across the road and ended up succumbing to his injuries on the doorstep of his own house, where his wife was watching from the window. Another 10 Lexington men were wounded but survived the morning, though several of them would carry their injuries with them for life. The colonial militia managed only a few scattered shots in reply. One British private was lightly wounded, and Pitcairn's horse was nicked, possibly twice. The whole engagement, from the first crack to the last, lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes by most reckonings. The regulars reformed, gave a victory cheer, and continued their march to Concord, where the next phase of the morning was already waiting for them. It was over so fast that most of the men present didn't have a clear memory of any single first shot. They remembered the sound of it, and the side of the green it seemed to come from, and the smoke that followed, but beyond that, the accounts of the day diverge almost immediately. Both the British and the Americans understood almost at once what was at stake. Within 4 days of the engagement, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, sitting at Watertown, had ordered depositions taken from anyone who'd been on or near the green that morning. They produced dozens of sworn statements, rushed them to a printer, and put a copy aboard a fast schooner called the Caro, with instructions to reach London before General Gage's own dispatch. The Caro made it first, and the colonial version of the morning was being read in English coffee houses before Gage's official report had even arrived in London. The colonial depositions given by Parker himself and by numerous other men in attendance at Lexington agreed on one essential point. The British fired first, and they fired without any provocation from the militia line. Several witnesses said they were already in the act of dispersing when the first shot came. A few claimed they'd distinctly seen a British officer on horseback fire a pistol before any of the British regulars discharged their muskets. If this account was accurate, this British officer, many of whom had a fairly openly hostile view of their colonial subjects by this point, may have fired that first shot. The British accounts, for their part, told a different story, as one might expect in a situation like this. Pitcairn, in writing to Gage and later to the Earl of Sandwich, insisted his men hadn't fired without orders, and that the first shot had come from behind a hedge or a stone wall. Lieutenant William Sutherland, who'd been mounted near Pitcairn, swore he'd seen a flash from behind a stone wall to the right of the British line. He thought that it was possibly fired by a man who wasn't part of Parker's drawn-up company at all, that perhaps it had been an observer who showed up and took a pot shot at the British. Still other British officers gave fragmentary accounts that didn't line up with the other accounts of that first shot, including Lieutenant Jesse Adair. You're going to want to keep Pitcairn, Sutherland, and Adair in mind, because I'll be coming back to them shortly. That stone wall has done an enormous amount of historical heavy lifting over the centuries. If you take the British accounts at face value, the most plausible scenario is that a single shooter, not under Parker's direct command, took a shot from cover at the head of the British column. The regulars would then have returned fire, which would have triggered Parker's men to fire back, which would have resulted in the disciplined volley that cut the colonial line apart. There's some support for this version in the colonial record as well. One man, who was watching from an adjacent field, gave a deposition stating that he'd seen a British officer fire a pistol on horseback, but also heard some scattered fire around the same time. One of the Lexington scouts captured by the British advance the previous evening similarly placed an early shot somewhere off the formed line. Importantly, none of these accounts directly contradict the colonial party line that the British fired first. However, they do suggest the situation on the green was a great deal messier than a clean two-side standoff. The most popular candidates for the mystery shooter are a militiaman who'd already started to disperse or an unaffiliated bystander watching from a window or doorway. However, another camp argues that the whole shot from behind the wall story was a face-saving fiction floated by Pitcairn afterward to shift responsibility away from his own officers. The competing theory, the one the Americans push the hardest, is that a British officer fired first, that the officer was probably mounted, and that the weapon was a pistol. The leading candidates have always been Pitcairn himself, Lieutenant Adair, and Lieutenant Sutherland. Pitcairn would later perish at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of the same year, before he could ever be cross-examined under more rigorous conditions. His version of events, that he never gave the order to fire and never discharged his own pistol on the green, is the version his family and the British military stuck with for the historical record. But despite this official finding, Biased as it may be, there is significant evidence that he or one of his officers was responsible. A pistol, in the chaos of a half-light morning, would have made a sharper, smaller crack than a musket. Several of the colonial witnesses described that opening sound as audibly different from the volleys that follow. This is part of why the pistol theory has had such staying power in the historical record. That detail came from men who'd grown up around these weapons and knew exactly what a pistol sounded like as opposed to a musket. That said, these accounts also came from men who had an incentive to remember they heard a pistol being fired. After all, the British firing first on dispersing colonial militiamen made a much better rallying cry than the militiamen firing first and paying a heavy price in combat. What we have, when the depositions are stacked side by side and the smoke has had 2.5 centuries to clear, is a question with several plausible answers and no decisive one. We have sworn statements written within days of the event by men who saw the same morning from incompatible vantage points. The shot that kicked off a revolution turns out to be the shot that nobody, on either side of the line that morning, ever quite agreed afterward to claim as their own. In 922, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad bin Fadlan was sent from Baghdad on a mission to the Volga Bulgars. Somewhere along the river, he encountered a group of traders he'd never seen before. These men were towering and blonde, with tattoos from their necks to their hands, and they carried axes and swords. He watched as they conducted a funeral involving a burning ship for one of their chieftains. He was looking at Norsemen, and they were a very, very long way from Scandinavia. But here's the thing most people don't fully appreciate. The Viking world wasn't a line drawn from Norway to England and back. It was a web that stretched from the frozen coasts of Newfoundland to the sun-scorched walls of Seville, from the marble halls of Constantinople to the merchant stalls of Baghdad. No civilization of their era covered more ground, and the arguments over just how far they reached are still generating debate among historians. The most famous claim to Viking range is North America. The Norse sagas had long spoken of lands to the west discovered by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. For centuries, mainstream scholarship treated these as semi-mythological. That changed in 1961, when a Norwegian team began excavating a site at Lance aux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. What they found was unambiguous: 8 timber-framed turf structures built in a distinctly Norse style, a forge, workshops, and evidence of iron smelting. Radiocarbon dating initially placed the settlement around 990 to 1020, and a 2021 study using a solar storm marker in tree rings pinpointed the occupation to exactly 1021. This remains the only confirmed Norse settlement in the Americas. But was it the furthest west they went? That's where it gets complicated. Evidence recovered at Lance aux Meadows includes butternuts and butternut wood, neither of which grows anywhere near Newfoundland. The closest natural source is hundreds of miles south, around New Brunswick or the St. Lawrence Valley. This strongly suggests the Norse were making expeditions well beyond their base camp. The settlement itself appears to have been a staging post and not a permanent colony, since there are no burials, no signs of agriculture, and no livestock pens. The Norse came, gathered resources, and left within roughly a decade. The question of whether they pushed even further has produced spectacular false starts. In 2015, archaeologist Sarah Parkak used satellite imagery to identify a site called Point Rose on Newfoundland's southwest coast. Initial excavations turned up what appeared to be a turf wall and evidence of iron working. But by 2017, further investigation concluded there was no evidence whatsoever of Norse presence. The turf wall was natural, and the iron was bog iron deposited by geological processes. Then there's the Kensington Runestone, found in Minnesota in 1898, which purports to record a Norse expedition into the North American interior in 1362. The scholarly verdict has been consistent since its first examination in 1910. It's a 19th century hoax. The language is a distinctively more modern version of Swedish, not a medieval Scandinavian language. The inscription also shows minimal weathering, despite supposedly lying buried for over 5 centuries. Scholars now generally believe that it was a hoax, perpetrated by a Scandinavian immigrant to establish an imagined past connection with their new homeland. Far more intriguing is the main penny, a Norwegian silver coin from the reign of King Olaf III of Norway, who ruled from 1067 to 1093. It was found in 1957 at the Goddard Archaeological Site in Penobscot Bay, Maine, a site dating to roughly the year 1200, give or take a couple decades. Unlike the Kensington runestone, the coin is absolutely genuine, with the mystery being the question of how it got there. No other Norse artifacts were found at the site, but the Goddard site was a major hub of indigenous trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to Labrador. The scholarly consensus is that the coin reached Maine through native trade and then passed hand to hand from Norse sources further north. It doesn't prove Vikings walked on Maine soil, but it proves their material world extended further than their physical presence. While the westward push gets the most attention, at least in North America, the Viking raids into southern Europe were arguably more audacious. In 844, a Norse fleet sailed up the Guadalquivir River and took the city of Seville, holding it for weeks before being driven out by the forces of the Emir of Seville. The counterattack was devastating, and somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Vikings were slain, and 30 of their ships destroyed using an off-brand version of Greek fire. Around 860, a fleet reportedly led by Bjorn Ironside and Haystein, yes, of Crusader Kings fame, pushed through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean proper. They raided the coast of North Africa, struck targets in southern France, and sacked the Italian city of Pisa, before continuing on toward Sicily. Whether they actually believed they were attacking Rome, as some later sources claim, is debatable, but the sheer geographic scope of the expedition is staggering. Vikings in the Mediterranean, raiding Islamic Spain and North Africa and Christian Italy in the same campaign. It reads like fiction, but the Arab, Frankish, and Italian sources all corroborate it independently. The eastern expansion is where the Viking reach becomes truly global. The Varangians, predominantly Swedish Vikings who settled across what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, followed the Eurasian Great Rivers to their ends. On June 18, 860, a fleet of roughly 200 Viking ships carrying an estimated 20,000 warriors attacked Constantinople itself. It was the richest and most fortified city in the known world, a city coveted by every conqueror and raider imaginable. The assault was documented by Patriarch Photius, who witnessed it firsthand. The Norsemen plundered the suburbs and coastline around the Sea of Marmara. However, they failed to breach the formidable Theodosian walls, a massive triple-layered defensive system with towers and moats that protected the landward side. These walls, among the strongest fortifications in the medieval world, prevented direct assault and ensured the city itself remained secure. Lacking siege equipment and facing a well-defended core, the Vikings could not penetrate the defenses. According to later Byzantine sources, the attack ended abruptly, sometimes attributed to a storm or divine intervention. However, despite this rocky beginning, the Byzantines respected the Viking raiders, and eventually, the relationship became less adversarial. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, served as personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. But Constantinople wasn't the end of the line. The Volga trade route carried Norsemen south and east into the Islamic world. Viking merchants appeared in Baghdad by the mid-9th century, trading furs, honey, and human beings for the silver that fueled Scandinavian economies. In 913, a force of 500 ships launched a massive raid on the Caspian Sea coast, pillaging the regions of Gorgan, Gilan, and Mazandaran in present-day Iran. These were full-scale military operations conducted thousands of miles from Scandinavia and Russia, where these Vikings were based. Perhaps the most poignant illustration of Viking Eastern ambition is the expedition of Ingvar the Far-Traveled, who departed Sweden in the late 1030s with 30 ships. His fleet sailed through the Russian river systems to Novgorod, then Kiev, eventually reaching the Black Sea and the territory of Georgia, where they fought a number of pitched battles. Only one ship returned, and 26 runestones were erected across Sweden to commemorate the men who didn't come back. This is the largest single collection of memorial runestones for any Viking expedition. They stand as quiet testimony to how far ambition could carry a Norse crew, and how far from home they were willing to die. So where was the absolute furthest point the Vikings reached? It depends on how you measure it. If we're talking confirmed boots-on-the-ground archaeological evidence, it's Lonso Meadows, roughly 4,000 miles west of Scandinavia. If you're following the military expeditions east, Vikings were conducting raids on the shores of the Caspian Sea, over 2,500 miles from their homeland, by the river routes they traveled. If you're counting trade and diplomatic contact, Norsemen were present in Baghdad, deep in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, though there, they were definitely acting as traders, not raiders. The historical arguments aren't really about whether the Vikings got to these places. The evidence for their presence in North America, the Mediterranean, Constantinople, and the Caspian is solid. The debate is about the gray areas and whether they pushed further into the North American interior. It's also about whether individual Norsemen wandered even further than the expeditions we can clearly document. Ultimately, given what we know, it's theoretically possible that a small group of Vikings may have even done something as audacious as travel along the Silk Road, reaching China. That said, at present there's just no evidence for it, but given their confirmed wanderlust, it's entirely possible. Here's a story that's been retold for nearly 900 years, and nobody can agree on whether it actually happened. In December 1140, a group of women reportedly walked out of a besieged castle in southern Germany, carrying their husbands on their backs. A king, against the objections of his own brother, let them do it due to a deal they made. It's exactly the kind of tale that sounds too perfect to be true, and that, as it turns out, is precisely the problem. To understand what happened at Weinsberg, we need to examine and understand the mess that was 12th century German politics. In 1137, Holy Roman Emperor Lothair III died, and what followed was one of those succession crises that medieval Europe seemed to specialize in. The obvious heir was Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony, head of the powerful Welf dynasty and Lothair's son-in-law. He had the military strength, the political connections, and every reasonable expectation that the crown would pass smoothly to him. But the electors of the realm had a different plan, and on the 7th of March, 1138, they elected Conrad of Hohenstaufen, a deliberate snub to the Welf dynasty. Conrad wasn't about to share power with the man he'd just edged out, so he placed Henry the Proud under imperial ban and stripped him of both his duchies. The powerful holdings of Bavaria and Saxony were gone in a single stroke, and the Welfs and their loyalists, predictably, didn't take this well. What followed was an escalating civil war between two of the most powerful families in the Holy Roman Empire, the Hohenstaufen and the Welfs. It's a conflict whose echoes would eventually give rise to the Italian words Guelph, and Ghibelline, labels for factions that would go on to define Italian politics for centuries. But in 1140, it was still a very German affair, fought castle by castle and town by town across Swabia. Weinsberg was a small fortified town near Heilbronn, in what's now the state of Baden-Württemberg. Its castle sat on a hill overlooking the Weinsberger Tal, and by 1140 it had become a Welf stronghold held by Welf VI, the brother of the now-deceased Henry the Proud. Conrad III decided to break Welf power in northern Swabia, and Weinsberg was his target. He brought what amounted to the bulk of his army south, accompanied by his elder brother Frederick, Duke of Swabia. Welf VI attempted to relieve the castle with a field army and was decisively beaten by Conrad and Frederick's combined forces on the field. With no relief coming and no prospect of holding out, the defenders of Weinsberg had no choice but to negotiate a surrender. And it's here, at the moment of capitulation, that the story takes its famous turn. According to the account that's come down to us, Conrad offered terms that were harsh but not unusual for the period. The men inside the castle, the garrison, the Welf loyalists, anyone who'd taken up arms, would face the king's judgment, which in this context meant certain doom. But the women would be allowed to leave freely, and each one could take with her whatever she could carry on her shoulders. It was a standard concession since women and children were frequently granted safe passage in the aftermath of medieval sieges. The stipulation about carrying possessions was, on its face, a small mercy, letting them leave with some clothing, perhaps some valuables, rather than walking out empty-handed. But the women of Weinsberg, so the story goes, had a very different interpretation of what counted as their most valuable possession. When the gates opened and the women emerged, they weren't carrying bundles of clothing or bags of silver. Each woman had her husband on her back. They'd taken the king's words at face value, and they could carry out whatever they valued most, and what they valued most was their men. The story goes that some of Conrad's advisors were furious. His brother Frederick reportedly objected, arguing that this wasn't what the king had intended, and that the women were making a mockery of the surrender terms. But Conrad, and this is the part that's kept the story alive for chroniclers in the early years, supposedly refused to go back on his word. A king's promise, he reportedly declared, should never be broken, so he let the men go. The castle itself was taken, and Welf VI's cause in northern Swabia was effectively finished. But the lives that should have been forfeit were saved by what was, in effect, a very clever bit of medieval lawyering. This is where things get complicated, because when you start pulling at the threads of this story, it unravels fairly quickly. The earliest known account of the wife-carrying episode comes from the Royal Chronicle of Cologne, an anonymous Latin chronicle first compiled around 1175. This puts it roughly 35 years after the siege itself, though it likely worked substantially from earlier, now lost sources. The chronicle is generally considered a respectable source for 12th century German history, but it isn't a contemporary eyewitness account. It's a retrospective compilation, written a generation later and hundreds of miles from Weinsberg. More troubling is what's absent from other sources. Otto of Freising, one of the most important chroniclers of the period, and, notably, Conrad's own half-brother, wrote extensively about the Welf-Hohenstaufen conflict. He doesn't mention the women of Weinsberg at all, a fact that seems odd given that it portrays Conrad as a just and lawful ruler. After all, even though he was, in essence, outwitted by the women in the castle, he accepted this minor defeat graciously, showing a great deal of character. It's also absent from the Historia Welforum, a pro-Welf chronicle that would have had every reason to celebrate a story in which Welf women outwitted a Hohenstaufen king. If this had actually happened, You'd expect propagandists on both sides to have been dining out on it for decades. The Hohenstaufen faction can portray their leader as a truly righteous and just ruler who ultimately won the day, while the Welf side could challenge Conrad's masculinity. Their joint silence on an event that both sides could very easily spin in their direction is, to put it mildly, conspicuous. So we're left with a single source, written decades after the fact, with no corroboration from either side of the conflict. Of course, that isn't nothing. The Cologne Chronicle isn't unreliable as a rule, but it's thin ground on which to build absolute historical certainty. The historicity problem gets worse when you zoom out. The story of besieged women carrying their husbands to safety isn't unique to Weinsberg. In Germany alone, there are a number of versions of similar events, so much so that the brothers Grimm documented it as part of German folk tradition. They treated it largely as folklore or legend, though given the context that they were working in, that may have been their own bias at play. Notably, it's important to remember that simply because similar stories have rooted themselves into folklore, it doesn't mean an original origin story didn't exist or happen. Interestingly, the other similar versions of this event set in Germany all take place after the Weinsberg siege. That suggests that it's possible that this could have been the origin story of the event, and from there, the story spread and attached itself to other stories. After all, it's a very good narrative device, and people love stories where the perceived underdog scores a big win through clever behavior. It also vaguely reminds me of the story of Lady Godiva's famous ride through Coventry. They both feature women performing unusual physical acts to subvert the decree of a powerful man, though obviously there are numerous differences in the narrative. The story might have remained an obscure entry in a medieval chronicle if not for its rediscovery during the Renaissance. Around the year 1500, Johannes Trithemius, the abbot of Sponheim, found the tale, likely in the Cologne Chronicle, and incorporated it into his Hirsau Chronicle. However, this was a hand-produced, traditional document, and so it couldn't be mass-produced. But from there, the printing press would quickly do its work. From there, it was picked up by Johannes Nauclerus, a historian who sought to chronicle world history from the creation of Adam to 1500. His World Chronicle, as it's known in English, was published in 1516, and was the first time the faithful wives of Weinsberg's story appeared in print. Thanks to the book's multiple editions, the story spread rapidly through educated German-speaking circles. From there, it entered into the realm of generally accepted historical fact, despite the shaky foundation of this legend. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the tale had become rich literary material, and a number of German authors adapted it during the Romantic period. Meanwhile, the castle ruins at Weinsberg were rechristened Burg Weibertreu, which according to Google Translate means Faithful Women's Castle, which makes sense in the context. Ultimately, you're probably still asking whether the event actually happened. Personally, I think the honest answer is that there's likely a significant element of truth to it, but the tale was exaggerated in the telling. The single source problem is the most significant, since if the narrative happens as we're told, it would have been more widely reported. The absence of the story from both pro-Hohenstaufen and pro-Welf chronicles is extremely hard to explain, since it has propagandistic value for both sides. That said, if the actual event was less spectacular than the story that was reported in the Cologne Chronicle, it may make sense that it was absent from both these partisan sources. Something almost certainly happened at Weinsberg, which planted the seed for the legend which grew over the coming decades. We know that medieval sieges regularly ended with negotiated terms that included safe passage for women. It's entirely conceivable that some act of defiance or cleverness during the evacuation got exaggerated and romanticized over the following decades. It's also theoretically possible, given the hatred the two sides had for each other in the campaign, that being carried out by women may have been some sort of humiliation ritual. If this was the case, it may make sense that neither side wanted to report it in their chronicle. That's just pure speculation on my part, though, and there's no evidence to suggest this was the case. It's possible that the Cologne chronicler may have been recording a garbled, multi-decade echo of a real incident, or they may have been embellishing the record to make a point about royal mercy or the sanctity of a king's word. That's ultimately what the story is about, whatever its origins, since this isn't fully a tale about clever wives, but a good king. If it was simply a narrative about selfless, clever wives, it would have actually made a better story to have Conrad punish them and their husbands for their actions. Conrad honors his word even when doing so undercuts his own military victory, and that's the moral the chronicler wanted to land. Whether the women of Weinsberg actually carried their husbands down that hill in December 1140, we'll likely never know for certain. But the fact that people have been telling this story for nearly 9 centuries tells you something about what we want from history. Not just plain facts, but meaning. And the clever wives who put their necks on the line to carry their husbands to safety is a compelling and meaningful historical narrative. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the share button and send this video to your friends and family who appreciate history. Also, as usual, don't forget that you can check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon to support my channel further. On a summer day in Tudor England, a person might feel a slight chill and a faint pain behind the eyes. By nightfall, they could be drenched in sweat and fighting for their life. In 1528, a French ambassador in London remarked that it was the easiest disease in the world to die from. Mild aches in the head and chest could suddenly turn fatal as a drenching fever swept over the victim. This swift and deadly illness was the notorious English sweating sickness, a mysterious epidemic that struck fear into rich and poor alike. The first outbreak of sweating sickness erupted in 1485, just as Henry Tudor seized the English throne, and a terrifying contagion swept through London. Contemporary reports claim that roughly 15,000 Londoners, nearly 1/3 of the city's population, perished in 6 weeks. The disease was so feared that the new king postponed his coronation to avoid infection. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the outbreak vanished completely by the autumn of 1485. Over the next few decades, the sweat returned in sporadic waves. In 1502, the illness may have even taken the life of Prince Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII. Another outbreak hit in 1507, followed by a much larger epidemic in 1517. Each time, the illness raged for only a few weeks before fading away again. This pattern of sudden, short-lived epidemics made the sweating sickness stand out from other pestilences of the era, which typically lingered for months or years. The most devastating wave struck in 1528, spreading terror across England and even reaching into parts of continental Europe. The epidemic of 1528 began in London in late spring, then rapidly swept across England, sparing only the far north, and even crossed the sea. In London, the death toll climbed so quickly that King Henry VIII fled his capital in a panic. Henry VIII, often remembered as a bold monarch, was in fact a notorious hypochondriac. When he learned that the dreaded disease was back, he broke up the royal court and fled to the countryside, moving between safe houses. Courtiers with means also fled, while the poor had no choice but to remain crowded in the disease-ridden city. Even the king's inner circle wasn't spared. Anne Boleyn fell ill with the sweat while sheltering at her family's castle in Kent. Despite Henry's professions of love, he kept his distance, and instead dispatched his physician, along with a heartfelt letter to care for Anne. Fortunately, she survived her bout of sickness. Many others at court were less lucky. Thomas Cromwell lost his wife and 2 daughters in the 1528 outbreak, and the Duke of Suffolk lost 2 young sons to the disease. Even the powerful Cardinal Wolsey was infected, though he managed to recover. From England, the 1528 epidemic leapt to mainland Europe. Merchants or travelers carried the disease to the port of Hamburg, where it arrived by July 1529. From there, the sickness spread across other parts of Germany and into Scandinavia, causing brief but lethal outbreaks in cities from Cologne to Stockholm. Strangely, it never penetrated France or Italy at all, despite frequent travel by German merchants and nobles to those regions. By the end of 1529, the sweat had entirely vanished from Europe as suddenly as it had appeared, and it never returned to the continent. What made the English sweat so frightening was the speed of its course. A prominent physician of the time, John Caius, who treated victims during the final 1551 outbreak, recorded that the sickness typically began suddenly. Victims first had the chills and then experienced violent shivering, dizziness, headache, and intense pains in the neck and limbs. Within mere hours, this cold stage gave way to a raging fever and drenching perspiration. Patients became feverishly hot, delirious, and desperately thirsty as their hearts pounded. Many felt an overwhelming urge to sleep, which Caius warned was often a fatal omen. If a sufferer succumbed to that drowsiness, they might never wake up. Astonishingly, a full cycle of the illness could run its course in a single day. People were either dead or recovering within about 24 hours of the first symptoms. Unlike diseases such as bubonic plague, the sweating sickness produced no telltale swellings or sores on the body. Its signature feature was the extensive clammy sweat, accompanied by a feeling of suffocation and chest pain. The illness struck most often in the warmer months of summer and early autumn, and it could recur in the same person, so surviving one attack didn't grant immunity. Some individuals, such as Cardinal Wolsey, endured multiple bouts over the years and lived to tell of it. But in many areas, the death rate was ghastly. Reports from the time claimed mortality as high as 30% to 50% of those who caught the sweat. With no understanding of the cause and no effective treatment, Tudor physicians and patients were left helpless against this aggressive affliction. The question of what the sweating sickness was has puzzled physicians, scientists, and historians for centuries. Even in the 1500s, people recognized it wasn't like the epidemics they knew. Lacking any germ theory, Tudor doctors blamed bad air or poisonous mists for the illness. Modern researchers have combed through historical records to propose possible culprits, but no single explanation perfectly fits all the facts. One theory is that the sweat was triggered by a hantavirus infection, a type of virus carried by rodents. Hantaviruses can cause severe acute illnesses and have sparked deadly outbreaks in other times and places, which makes this an intriguing possibility. Another hypothesis is that the disease was a form of inhaled anthrax poisoning, perhaps from handling contaminated wool, which can cause sudden fever and sweating if breathed in. Some have even speculated about a mosquito-borne virus similar to dengue fever. None of these theories is completely satisfying. Anthrax and hantavirus infections today don't usually spread rapidly from person to person. Yet Tudor accounts imply that the sweat could sweep through households and towns with frightening speed. Another clue comes from a later illness known as Picardy sweat, which broke out in France a few centuries after the English sweat disappeared. Investigators in the 19th century noted that French farm workers who slept close to the ground were often victims, hinting that rodents and their fleas might have been involved. Yet the Picardy sweat came with a skin rash, a detail never mentioned despite the numerous English accounts from English writers. The legacy of the sweating sickness is one of fear and mystery. In its time, it appeared without warning, killed swiftly, and then vanished completely. It altered royal decisions, haunted a generation, and left behind an enduring medical enigma. 5 centuries later, the English sweating sickness remains a sobering reminder of how an epidemic can blaze through humanity and then disappear, leaving only terrified recollections. Imagine a dusty storage room in the labyrinthine depths of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in the autumn of 1929. A German theologian named Gustav Deissmann is hunched over stacks of neglected manuscripts, cataloging items that have lain forgotten for centuries. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed, the Republic of Turkey is barely 6 years old, and no one is quite sure what treasures lie buried in the old Sultan's palace. Deissmann unfurls a sheet of gazelle skin, yellowed with age and bearing elaborate illustrations in faded ink. He sees coastlines, ships with billowing sails, exotic animals, and inscriptions in Ottoman Turkish. He doesn't yet realize that he is holding a fragment of one of the most controversial maps in human history. He's holding a document that will ignite debates about medieval and ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, and the very nature of discovery itself. The Piri Reis map, as it would come to be known, was created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Muhyiddin Piri, who earned the honorific Reis, meaning admiral. Only about 1/3 of the original world map survives today, showing the Atlantic Ocean, the western coasts of Europe and Africa, and the eastern coastline of the Americas. The surviving fragment measures roughly 90 by 63 centimeters and is painted on gazelle hide in vivid colors that have faded but not disappeared over 5 centuries. What makes this particular document extraordinary isn't merely its age or its beauty, but the claims its creator made about his sources and the mysteries those claims have spawned. Piri Reis was born around 1465 in Gallipoli, a strategic naval town on the Dardanelles that served as a base for Ottoman maritime operations. His education in the arts of the sea began early, and his uncle, Kemal Reis, was one of the most feared corsairs in the Mediterranean. These were privateers who terrorized Spanish, Venetian, and other European shipping while serving the Ottoman Sultan. In essence, they were state-sponsored pirates. The young future admiral joined his uncle's crew at the age of 11 or 12, learning navigation, combat, and cartography in the crucible of actual naval battles. For decades, he sailed the Mediterranean and beyond, accumulating geographical knowledge that few could match. The map itself was completed in the month of Muharram in the Islamic year 919, corresponding to March or April of 1513. Piri Reis presented it to Selim the Grim in 1517 during the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. He was perhaps hoping to demonstrate the strategic value of his geographical expertise to the empire's expanding ambitions. The timing was significant. Columbus had reached the Caribbean only 21 years earlier. Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope just 15 years before. The great age of European exploration was in its infancy, and yet here was an Ottoman admiral producing a world map of remarkable sophistication. The inscriptions on the map, written in Ottoman Turkish, provide a window into Piri Reis's methodology and his sources. He claimed to have consulted approximately 20 maps in constructing his composite image of the Atlantic world. Among these, he listed 8 Ptolemaic maps from the classical tradition, 4 Portuguese maps, an Arabic map, and a map that he claimed was made by Columbus himself. According to Piri Reis, this Columbus map had been captured from a Spanish sailor during a naval engagement in the Mediterranean in 1501. The sailor had reportedly accompanied Columbus on 3 voyages to the New World and carried a copy of the explorer's own chart. This claim about the Columbus source has fascinated historians for nearly a century. No map made by Columbus is known to survive. The Peary Race map shows the Caribbean islands with reasonable accuracy, including Cuba, Hispaniola, and the coastline that Columbus would have encountered on his voyages. The depiction isn't perfect, but it is consistent with the fragmentary knowledge that Spanish explorers possessed in the first decade of the 16th century. The shape of the islands, their relative positions, and certain specific details all point toward an early Spanish original. The controversy that has swirled around the Peary Race map for decades, however, has less to do with Columbus than with the strange landmass depicted at the southern edge. The coastline extends southward from what appears to be South America, curving dramatically toward the east, in a manner that has provoked wild speculation. In 1960, a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, named Charles Hapgood, made a startling claim. He argued that this southern portion of the map depicted the coastline of Antarctica, and not merely Antarctica as we know it today, but Antarctica as it would appear without its ice sheet. Hapgood published his theory in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, proposing that the Peary Race map preserved geographical knowledge from a lost civilization. The implications of Hapgood's theory were extraordinary. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 3 centuries after Peary Race created his map. Hapgood's book attracted the attention of fringe theorists, ancient astronaut enthusiasts, and Atlantis believers, who seized upon the map as evidence for their various speculations. The scholarly consensus, however, offers a far more mundane explanation. The southern landmass on the Peary Race map is almost certainly not Antarctica at all. It's most likely a continuation of the South American coastline, distorted and bent eastward due to the conventions of Portolan chart construction. Portolan charts, the navigational maps used by Mediterranean sailors, typically showed coastlines curving around the edges of the parchment. They weren't designed to represent the spherical Earth on a flat surface with mathematical precision, but rather, they were practical tools for coastal navigation. When Peary Race compiled his map from multiple sources, he was forced to reconcile different scales, orientations, and projections. Furthermore, the map may reflect the widespread Renaissance belief in a great southern continent, a hypothetical terra australis that appeared on many maps of the period. European cartographers had theorized since ancient times that a massive landmass must exist in the southern hemisphere to balance the known continents of the north. This theoretical continent appeared on maps long before any explorer actually reached Antarctic waters. The southern landmass on the Peary Race map may simply represent this speculative geography, drawn from sources that were themselves based on theory rather than observation. What remains undeniable is the remarkable achievement that the map represents within its proper historical context. In 1513, the Ottoman Empire was engaged in an intellectual golden age, synthesizing knowledge from Arab, Persian, Greek, and now Renaissance European sources. Peary Race stood at the intersection of multiple cartographic traditions and was able to synthesize them in a way few others could. He could read Arabic and had access to Islamic geographical texts that preserved classical learning largely still lost to medieval Europe. He also had access through naval combat and Mediterranean commerce to the latest Portuguese and Spanish discoveries. His map represents a moment of extraordinary cultural exchange, when information flowed across hostile borders and religious divides through the universal language of trade and conflict. Peary Race would go on to produce an even more impressive work called the Book of Navigation in English, completed in 1521 and revised in 1525. This comprehensive atlas of the Mediterranean contained over 200 detailed charts and sailing directions, representing decades of accumulated maritime knowledge. He continued to serve the Ottoman Navy into old age, eventually rising to the rank of Admiral of the Fleet in the Arabian Sea. After an unsuccessful campaign against the Portuguese in the Persian Gulf in 1552, he returned to Egypt, where he was accused of abandoning his fleet. The Ottoman governor of Egypt ordered him beheaded, and the great cartographer died in disgrace, and his world map was rolled up and forgotten in a palace storeroom. Picture yourself standing on the muddy banks of the River Blackwater in Essex on a humid August afternoon in the year 991. The air is thick with the salt of the estuary and the metallic tang of impending violence. On one side of the tidal causeway stands Beernoth, a proud English nobleman with a shield wall of local farmers and hardened warriors. On the other, separated by the rising water, waits a fleet of dragon-headed ships, led by Vikings, who haven't come for land, but for portable wealth. The Vikings make an offer that will echo through English history: pay us, and we'll leave. Beernoth, driven by a fatal overconfidence, refuses. He lets them cross the ford to fight. Hours later, he's dead. His army is broken, and the road to England's heartland lies open. In the aftermath of this disaster, known to history as the Battle of Maldon, the English government made a pragmatic decision that would change the economic landscape of Europe. They didn't keep fighting. They handed over 10,000 pounds of silver to buy peace. This payment marked the beginning of the Danegeld, a phenomenon that would drain the nation's treasury. It would also spark fierce academic debates 1,000 years later, and ironically, lay the foundation for the most efficient tax system in the medieval world. In the late 10th century, England was ruled by King Ethelred II, a man whose nickname Unready is a poor translation of an Old English pun meaning ill-advised. Ethelred presided over a wealthy centralized state, but he faced a threat unlike any in generations. The Viking fleets of the 990s weren't small bands of raiders, but massive organized armies capable of coordinating strikes across the entire coast. The logic was cold and calculated. The cost of a ravaged countryside, burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and dead subjects was often higher than the cost of the tribute. So, in 991, they paid 10,000 Roman pounds of silver. It was a staggering sum, roughly 3 tons of precious metal. But paying an extortionist rarely makes them go away forever. The Vikings returned in 994, this time led by kings like Sweyn Forkbeard and Olaf Tryggvason. They besieged London, and while the city held, the surrounding lands burned. To save the country, Ethelred paid again, 16,000 pounds this time. The payments escalated with terrifying speed. By 1002, the price of peace had risen to 24,000 pounds. In 1007, it was 36,000. By 1012, following the brutal sack of Canterbury, the English handed over a colossal 48,000 pounds of silver. These were massive transfers of capital that required a sophisticated administrative machine to collect. The English state had to mobilize its sheriffs and reeves to assess land, collect coin, and transport tons of silver to the waiting ships. The entirety of one of Europe's most advanced economies had been hijacked for the sole purpose of paying off the Norsemen. This massive hemorrhage of wealth has led historians to a fierce debate about just how onerous the Danegeld was. For a long time, the prevailing view, championed by scholars like M.K. Lawson, was that the Danegeld was a crushing burden that impoverished the English people. Lawson, in his 1984 paper on the topic, noted that the sheer volume of silver mentioned in the chronicles was over 100,000 pounds in total. He further noted that this would have represented a significant percentage of the nation's gross domestic product. In an agrarian society where 90% of the population worked the land, extracting this much wealth would have been devastating. It likely forced peasants to sell their land or sell themselves into serfdom just to pay their share, fundamentally altering the social structure of England. However, another school of thought, led by historians like John Gillingham, offers a fascinating counter-narrative. Gillingham suggests that we shouldn't just look at the cost, but at the capability. The fact that England could pay these astronomical sums repeatedly without collapsing is evidence of extraordinary economic resilience. It suggests that England was vastly wealthier than its neighbors, flush with silver from the wool trade with the continent. Gillingham also floated the idea that the chroniclers might have exaggerated the sums to criticize the king. In essence, they may have simply been throwing out increasingly large numbers to paint a picture of complete collapse by the English state. However, he also states that even if the numbers are accurate, the ability to collect them proves the efficiency of the English bureaucracy. Interestingly, he notes that later monarchs looked back on the Danegeld not with shame, but with envy, seeing the power to levy such a tax as a precious jewel in the royal crown. We don't just have to rely on written chronicles to understand the scale of this wealth transfer. The evidence is buried in the ground, and archaeology tells a vivid story. Huge hordes of Anglo-Saxon coins have been found across Scandinavia, potentially containing more English silver coinage than has been found in England itself. One of the most telling details comes from the coins themselves. Many English pennies found in Sweden bear peck marks. These are small nicks made by a knife. In England, in the time of Ethelred, the king's coin was accepted at face value, and you didn't question the image of royal authority. But the Vikings didn't care about Ethelred's regal face. They lived in a bullion economy where value was determined by weight and purity. They pecked the coins to check that they were solid silver all the way through. These little scars are physical proof of the Danegeld, evidence of money moving from a trust-based economy to a skepticism-based one. Runestones in Sweden even boast of men who took the Danegeld in England multiple times, carving their financial success into granite for eternity. The story of the Danegeld has a surprising twist. In 1012, after the massive payment of 48,000 pounds, the Viking leader Thorkel the Tall defected to Ethelred's side with 45 ships. To pay for this mercenary fleet, the government instituted a new annual tax known as the Heergeld, or army tax. This was a pivotal moment. The Danegeld transformed from a sporadic tribute paid to enemies into a regular tax paid to maintain a standing defense force. When the Danish king Canute eventually conquered England in 1016, he perfected this system. In 1018, he levied a record-breaking 72,000 pounds of silver from the nation to pay off his invasion fleet. After sending most of his ships home, he kept a smaller standing force funded by the Heergeld. For nearly 40 years, the English people paid an annual tax, creating a flow of revenue that made the English monarchy the richest in Western Europe. It wasn't until 1051 that Edward the Confessor abolished the Heergeld. Legends say he saw a devil sitting on the money chests and was moved by conscience, but it's more likely he simply wanted to curb the power of professional soldiers. When William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, he found a state with a unique capacity to tax its subjects. The Danegeld, and then the Heergeld, had forced the Anglo-Saxons to map their country's wealth in extreme detail. When William ordered the compilation of the Domesday Book in 1086, he was essentially conducting a massive audit of the Danegeld system. He wanted to know exactly how much his new kingdom was worth and who was liable to pay. The Norman kings revived the tradition, using it to fund expansion in France, proving that the administrative innovations born from the Viking crisis had long-lasting utility. In the end, the Danegeld was a tragedy for the generation that paid it. It stripped the country of its liquid capital and funded the very armies that eventually conquered it. But in the long view of history, it forged the English state. It necessitated a bureaucracy capable of assessing wealth and collecting revenue on a national scale. This was something no other European kingdom could match at the time. The silver may have flowed across the North Sea to buy weaponry and ships for further extortion, but the administrative steel remained in England. This government structure would endure long after the Viking longships had faded into the mists of history. In paying the price of peace, the English ironically accidentally bought themselves some semblance of a real bureaucratic state that would set them up for centuries of success. In the dark forests of medieval England, travelers once hurried through by daylight, wary of wolves lurking in the twilight shadows. At dusk, the distant howl of a wolf could send shivers through a village, a reminder that beyond the edge of the lamplight, untamed creatures lurked. These predators, feared and reviled, roamed the land for centuries, only to have their howls silenced forever by the close of the 15th century. The extermination of wolves in medieval England was no accident of nature, but a calculated human campaign to tame the wilds no matter what the cost. Wolves were an established part of Britain's environment long before the medieval era, having spread into the British Isles after the last ice age. By the early Middle Ages, they ranged across much of England, especially in the densely wooded regions. Archaeological finds and place names provide evidence of their presence. In Suffolk, the village of Woolpit got its name from Wolf Pit, referring to pits once dug to catch wolves. Anglo-Saxon records also mention wolves frequently. January was even dubbed Wolf Month in the Anglo-Saxon calendar, marking the season when nobles organized wolf hunts. One chronicler notes that in 957, King Edgar imposed an annual tribute of 300 wolf skins on the Welsh king. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, wolves had already been driven out of the more settled southern shires. They weren't totally exterminated, but remained most common in the wild forests of northern England and along the Welsh borders. After 1066, the Norman kings intensified anti-wolf measures. They not only continued the hunts, but also institutionalized them. Many nobles were granted lands on the condition that they keep the area free of wolves. For instance, William the Conqueror awarded the lordship of Ridsdale in Northumberland to Robert de Umfreville. In his charge, he specifically ordered him to defend that territory, quote, from enemies and wolves. Dedicated wolf hunters were employed by the crown, and there were typically no penalties for eliminating wolves regardless of social status. Early Plantagenet monarchs likewise supported wolf extermination through bounties, with a wolf pelt being worth up to 5 shillings. To put this in context, 5 shillings represented about 60 days of labor for a farmhand, so this was a huge sum at the time. This system unfortunately had the unintended effect of causing many dogs to go missing as well, in an attempt to cash in on these pelt bounties. For the English wolf, the 13th century marked the beginning of the end. In 1281, King Edward I, determined to rid his realm of wolves, issued an unprecedented edict ordering the total extermination of all wolves in England. He even appointed a royal official, Peter Corbett, to hunt down every last wolf across several counties along the Welsh marches. Local landowners were encouraged to assist in these efforts. Records even mention woods being deliberately burned to flush out wolf dens. The campaign under Edward I was largely effective. Reports of wolves became increasingly scarce after the 1280s. By 1290, one of the last known incidents of wolf damage, wolves slaughtering deer in a nobleman's forest, was noted as an extreme rarity. In fact, Around the year 1300, an English scholar attempting to procure wolf carcasses for medical study had to import dead wolves from abroad. This extreme measure implies that finding a local wolf in England had virtually become impossible at this time. By the early 14th century, wolves had been eliminated from most of England, surviving, if at all, only in the wildest regions. Monks at Whitby Abbey, for example, paid for the curing of 14 wolfskins in the 1390s, suggesting a remnant population in the forests of northeast Yorkshire at that time. Land grants and offices with the duty of eliminating wolves persisted into the 1400s, potentially an indication that authorities still contemplated the possibility of survivors. As late as 1433, a minor nobleman was recorded holding an estate in Nottinghamshire, with his duty being the sounding of a horn upon the sighting of wolves. Historians are divided on what this task actually meant. A plain reading of the evidence indicates that this nobleman was on watch for the last of England's wolves. However, an alternative reading favored by other scholars suggests that this was actually intended to be a cushy land grant. After all, if it was known that there was no wolves there, giving someone an estate and telling them to blow a horn if they see one is perhaps the easiest duty to discharge. Still, another reading suggests that the nobleman was owed a familial obligation, but wasn't generally seen as being competent. In essence, you get to be the head wolf watcher in the area, and you can't screw it up, because there's no actual wolves to watch anyway. Popular legend claims that the very last wolf in England was slain at Humphrey Head in the 14th century, though the accuracy of this tale is uncertain. What is clear is that by the end of the 1400s, wolves had vanished from England. The eradication of wolves was driven by a confluence of practical concerns and deep-seated cultural attitudes. Foremost was the protection of livestock. As agriculture expanded, especially sheep farming for the lucrative wool trade, wolves came to be seen as economic enemies. By the Middle Ages, the wool industry was vital to England's wealth, and wolves that preyed on sheep were deemed devilish predators, undermining prosperity. And I don't mean this in the modern metaphorical sense. I mean that they were actually perceived as agents of the Dark Lord, accosting the prosperity of the godly English. Wolves were also perceived as a danger to human life, though actual attacks on people were probably infrequent. Still, tales of wolves attacking travelers or children stoked fear, and there were tales of manhunters with high body counts stalking the countryside. Such stories, whether true or not, reinforced the view of wolves as a menace that had to be eliminated. Religious and folkloric beliefs further amplified this antipathy. In medieval Christian symbolism, the wolf was often cast as a creature allied with the devil, preying upon the innocent. Clergymen frequently warned of wolves in sermons, both as literal predators and as metaphorical agents of Satan. To the medieval mind, the wolf represented the untamed wilderness and chaos lurking beyond the village walls, essentially the opposite of orderly human civilization. This mindset was even codified in law, and in Anglo-Saxon England, a person declared an outlaw was branded a wolf's head. This meaning they were no longer protected by law and could be slain as freely as a wolf. In fact, eliminating wolves was thus framed as a virtuous duty, synonymous with protecting one's community. Because of this, the authorities offered the pardoning of minor crimes upon the presentation of a pelt, and local religious institutions even offered up spiritual rewards. Notably, in modern times, there is renewed interest in bringing wolves back to England's wild places. The very idea of reintroducing these long-absent predators, now recognized as important for ecosystems, stands in stark contrast to the medieval mindset that celebrated their eradication. A hidden cave on a remote island filled with medieval coins and weapons might sound like pirate lore, but in Australia's far north, such a legend is more than fiction. The story of the Marchinbar Island coins began when an Australian soldier discovered a handful of centuries-old coins buried in the sand, a find that has baffled historians for decades since. In 1944, Air Force pilot Maury Eisenberg was stationed at a remote post on Marchinbar Island in the Wessel Islands of the Northern Territory. At the time, the Wessel Islands were a dangerous, largely uncharted frontier where some believed Japanese soldiers may have infiltrated. But Eisenberg wasn't concerned with such matters, and while fishing on the beach one day, he spotted coins glinting in the sand. He scooped up 9 coins, marked the spot on a map, and put them in a tin. The coins sat forgotten for 35 years, until 1979, when Eisenberg had them examined in Sydney. Amazingly, 5 of the coins were identified as coins from the medieval Kilwa Sultanate in East Africa. The other 4 were Dutch East India Company coins from the 17th and 18th centuries. 2 of the corroded Kilwa coins recovered on Marchinbar Island were dated to around the 12th century and were clearly inscribed with Arabic script. The coins were the oldest foreign artifacts ever found in Australia, potentially upending conventional thought about Australian contact with the wider world. Kilwa Kisiwani was a wealthy Swahili trading port in East Africa that produced its own copper currency in medieval times. Finding its coins on an Australian beach was unprecedented, and outside Kilwa's homeland, only a single coin had been discovered in Arabia. Eisenberg's stash also included those 4 Dutch coins dated from 1690 to the 1780s. These Dutch coins have turned up on Australian shores before, but usually much further west. Finding them on this remote northern island alongside medieval African coinage from prior to the discovery of Australia by outsiders was completely unexpected. This odd mix of old coins raised a question. How did they end up on Marchinbar Island, a long uninhabited place far off known trade routes? Researchers have proposed a range of ideas to solve the riddle of the Marchinbar coins. One possibility is that they're evidence of direct contact between indigenous Australians and seafaring traders from the Indian Ocean centuries ago. Kilwa was part of a vast network of commerce across the Indian Ocean, so it's conceivable that African or Arab sailors ventured farther east than previously thought. In 1550, a Portuguese writer noted that the port of Malacca, in Malaysia, had resident merchants from places as far afield as Kilwa and Cairo. The writer mentioned that these communities had been established there for centuries, bolstering the credibility of the idea that the coins came directly from these traders. Perhaps a ship from those routes was blown off course or fleeing pirates and wrecked on the Wessel Islands, leaving the coins behind well before any recorded European contact. Another theory points to early European mariners. A Portuguese ship in the early 1500s could have brought the coins. The Portuguese sacked Kilwa in 1505 and reached Timor by 1514. Some experts argue they likely continued eastward and might have landed on Australia's northern shores, depositing coins and other relics along the way. Interestingly, Aboriginal lore recounts that white men with shining armor came from the sea, and even speaks of a cave in the Wessels filled with coins and weapons. This is possibly a cultural echo of an encounter with Europeans prior to its official discovery by Westerners. A third explanation credits Asian mariners and indigenous exchange. In the 18th centuries, fishermen from Sulawesi, now in Indonesia, regularly visited the region to trade with the local populace. It's believed that they occasionally stopped at the Wessels for shelter and fresh water. They might have given out old coins as tokens of friendship and goodwill, or perhaps as payment for goods. Indeed, Dutch copper coins from the 1600s have been found in Aboriginal camps, presumably left by Indonesian visitors. Some historians believe it's possible that vintage Kilwa coins were also circulating in the spice ports of the Indonesian archipelago as currency. This offers a very reasonable explanation for how the African coins became intermixed with the Dutch coins. Notably, in the last couple of decades, Chinese coins and other foreign coins have also been found in the region. This suggests that the ocean-going traders of the Indonesian archipelago may have been much more active in Australia than previously thought. However, very few archaeological surveys have been conducted in northern Australia, and the territory is vast. Further discoveries may provide additional support for the theory of further Indonesian involvement, or perhaps from African traders based out of one of these ports. Whether they washed ashore from a medieval Arab or African shipwreck, were left by Portuguese sailors, or came via Indonesian traders, the truth behind the Marchenbar coins remains elusive. However, the discovery is reshaping how we view Australia's early history. Outside exploration of the continent is traditionally thought to have begun with Dutch sailors in 1606, while Indonesian traders came by the 18th century. The Marchenbar coins, however, potentially hint at contact that predates those encounters, perhaps by several centuries.